The moon had no real name when the war began. Someone in high command had placed a marker on a star chart 11 years ago and labeled it Yaren 4, and the name stuck, the way bad names always do. Not because anyone liked it, but because too many people had died there for it to be called anything else. It was not a beautiful moon. It had never been beautiful. The earth was the color of old rust, cracked in long lines like the skin of something long dried out. The sky was brownish yellow, which gave everything a slightly sickly look. There were no trees. Once, there might have been grass, a low gray shrubbery covering the plains, but 11 years of artillery fire, troop movements, and chemical runoff had scorched most of it. What remained was mostly ash and stone, and the silence that follows after a very loud thing has finally gone quiet. Both sides had been fighting for Yaren 4 for 3 years, not because it had any value. The moon had no resources worth capturing, no strategic position worth holding, and no population worth protecting. It was worth nothing. Yet it sat on the border between human-controlled space and the territory held by the Galactic Commonwealth. And both sides, at some point, had decided that ceding it would matter. So, they continued to send soldiers there to die on the rusty ground under the sickly yellow sky, and neither side made much headway in any direction, and the moon remained worthless. On the morning the ceasefire flag was raised, a soldier from the winning army named Private Dara O'Hanlon lay in a shell crater about 200 meters from the human front line. She had been there for 6 hours. Her right leg was broken in 2 places. Her radio was dead, and she had used her last field dressing 3 hours ago. She was 19 years old. She had grown up in a coastal city in what used to be Nigeria, and she had joined the army because her brother was already serving there, and she had always followed her brother. Most of those 6 hours she had spent staring at the sky. There was nothing else to do. When the pain became intense, she would press her face into the dirt and breathe through it. When the pain subsided, she would stare at the sky again, at its yellow-brown color, at the way the light passed through it, thin and weak, not at all like the sunlight back home. She was not afraid of death. Oh, she had come to terms with it. What she feared was being left there, lying in a crater until she stopped breathing, and nobody finding her. Nobody would know which crater. She heard the ceasefire signal around noon, a long tone broadcast over all military frequencies, a sound that made her chest relax. Whether she wanted it to or not, she heard movement on the front line voices. Then she heard something she did not expect to hear. Someone was calling her name. They found her 20 minutes later, 2 medics in white suits. They were moving quickly across the open ground between the lines. One of them was her brother. He said nothing when he dropped into the crater beside her. He just touched her face with his hand for a second, checking her eyes. Then he got to work. That was the last thing Private Dara O'Hanlon clearly remembered from that morning. The truce had been agreed upon 3 days earlier through a neutral relay station at the edge of the Yaren system. Both sides had agreed to a 6-hour window for the evacuation of the wounded and the search for the dead. This was standard procedure. Both sides had done it before, on Yaren 4 and a dozen other contested moons and stations. The rules were clear, and both sides had signed them years ago. Wounded combatants are not combatants. Medical personnel are not combatants. The flag meant the firing had ceased. It was not complicated. The Vreth did not find it complicated. They found it incorrect. Sub-Executive Vreth stood at an observation post on a high ridge overlooking the plain and watched the humans moving across the field below. He was tall, even for a Vreth, with long, gray, plated limbs and a flat, wide head that his species had developed for cold conditions. Over his armor, he wore a dark blue command robe, the type that signaled a rank expecting unquestioning obedience. He had held his position for 9 years. For most of that time, he had been at war with humans. He watched the figures in white suits moving between craters and wreckage. He counted 41 of them. Most of them were medics. Some were carrying wounded on stretchers. Some were marking the dead with flags for later evacuation. Vreth was not a cruel creature. He did not enjoy suffering. He could not. He never considered himself someone who caused unnecessary harm. He considered himself practical. He considered himself logical. He watched the field below and carefully pondered the logic, as he always did, as his training taught him to approach every tactical question. A wounded human will heal. Such is the nature of humans. They healed from things that would finish other species. A healed human would return to the fight. A human who returned to the fight would kill more Vreth soldiers. 41 wounded humans. evacuated, healed, returned to the front line, represented a future force of 41 trained combatants. It was a measurable threat, preventable. He did not hate them. He simply calculated them. He gave the order to his weapons officer without raising his voice, and the first shots struck the medics. The Solon observer, Liren Say, was stationed at the Commonwealth Neutral Observation Station, a pressurized structure on the eastern edge of the plain that both sides had agreed to respect as an observation point. Her job was to observe the ceasefire and file a report. She had been doing this work for 6 years. She was calm and neat and wrote very clean reports. She was watching through her recording equipment when the first shots rang out. At first, she thought it was a random shot, an accident, a malfunction of a soldier's weapon from either side. She continued to watch. It was not an accident. She saw the medics fall. She saw the wounded on the stretchers fall. She saw the humans crawling toward the fallen turn. She saw all of this through her recording equipment, and for the first few minutes, she recorded nothing in her report because her hands were not working properly. She pressed her palms against the console so they wouldn't tremble. She had seen death before. She had filed reports after battles where 1,000 people died in a single day. She was not naive about war. She understood what war was, but a ceasefire flag was hanging in the air. She saw it from where she sat. It was still flying. It had been flying the whole time. She filed her report 40 minutes after silence had fallen on the field, and the Vreth weapons went quiet. The report was accurate. It listed what she had seen in the order she had seen it, with timestamps and attached video documentation. She was professional in this. She was a Solon, Hara. They were always professional. At the end of the report, she added one remark. She had not planned to add it. It came out of her without planning, as happens when something changes inside you and you haven't yet understood exactly what it is. She wrote, "The humans on the ridge who were watching the field, about 16 soldiers, did not shout or try to attack the Vreth positions. They did not fire back. My equipment could detect no sound from them. They just became very still. I have studied human behavioral patterns for years, and I could not identify what I saw in them at such a distance. I am unable to name what I observed. I want the report to reflect that I observed this." She sent the report. She sat in the observation station for a long time after that. Outside, the ceasefire flag was still flying over the field. The Vreth did not take it down. In Vraal's reasoning, there was nothing that would have broken the truce. He had not fired on active combatants. He had simply eliminated a future threat. The flag was still valid. The rules, as he understood them, were still absolute. He filed his own report. He called it effective field neutralization of future combatants. He used clean language. He was, in his own way, also a professional. Colonel Sarah Vance was in the main command shelter when the ceasefire shots began. She heard them before she understood what they were. When she reached the ridge, it was already over. She stood at the edge of the ridge and looked at the field. She was 44 years old, and she had fought in this war for 9 of those years and had seen things she tried not to think about, if possible. She looked at the field below and catalogued what she saw. She had trained herself to do this, to see clearly and file it in her memory before the rest of herself caught up. 41 people, most of them marked in white. Overturned stretchers, white suits, stained dark with rust-brown dirt and something darker. Her deputy, Lieutenant Chen, stood beside her. He was 26 years old and had been in this war for 2 years. He had not yet learned to look at things the way she did. He was not looking at the field. He was looking at her. She said nothing for a long time. The soldiers on the ridge were silent, not the kind of silence that comes when people are in shock. Another kind, the one that comes after the shock has already passed through you, and something was left that had no name in any language she knew, something old and deep, something that made no sounds. She turned and walked back to the command shelter. She sat at the console. She opened a communication channel with the Commonwealth High Command, not the Vreth Command, but the Commonwealth as a whole, with the united authority of the 4 races that governed it. She wanted to be sure the right people heard what she was about to say. She paused for a moment before speaking. She was choosing the right words. Not the greatest number of words, but the right ones. She said, "You should not have done that." She closed the channel. Lieutenant Chen followed her. He stood in the doorway. He said, "Careful, Colonel. What will we do next?" She was already dialing another frequency, the command post on Earth. The real command, not field, not sectoral. The people making decisions that could not be undone. "We will report," she said. We will report everything as it was. We will send the recording. We will send the Laura Sense report. We will send everything. And then she looked at the comm screen. She thought of the field, of the 41 names she would know by the end of the day. She already knew 2 of them. A medic named Yusuf, who once treated a hairline fracture in her rib and made her laugh in the process, which hurt, and she was grateful for the pain because the laugh was worth it. And the girl named Dara, whose brother was found next to her in the crater, both dead. 2. And then we will wait. Yes, she said, and see what kind of people we are. The Vreth High Command received her transmission. They registered it. The automated system flagged it for review, and a junior intelligence officer checked it and wrote a 2-line summary. Human Field Commander issued verbal response to ceasefire incident on Yaren 4. Tactical threat not identified. Observation recommended. The officer in charge of monitoring, who received this summary, read it, made a note, and moved on to other business. In the diplomatic chambers of the Commonwealth, the transmission was received by other eyes. Ambassador Dalhari 7 read it 4 times. He was the Commonwealth's oldest expert on human behavior. He had spent 30 years studying them. He had read their history, their wars, their literature, their laws. He had sat across from human diplomats, soldiers, teachers, and politicians. He thought he understood them as well as it was possible for a non-human. He had read the 6 words 6 times. You should not have done that. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk and read those words again, reflecting on what he knew about humans, which was a great deal, and thinking about what those words meant in the context of everything he knew. There was one human document he had studied many years ago. It was very old, written in a century when humans still killed each other with metal and fire on the same planet. It listed things that were unacceptable in war, protected categories, the wounded, the marked, the healers, those who had surrendered. He opened the document on his screen and read it. He had read it before. He had always considered it a historical artifact, an interesting testimony of early human civilization, something they had outgrown or at least learned to process more sophisticatedly. Now he read it again and felt something for which he could find no name. He began drafting a message to the Commonwealth High Command. He chose his words carefully. He was, like Lorescence, a professional. He tried to put into the message exactly what he believed, without exaggeration, without panic, without that feeling in his chest that made his hands do the same thing that Lorescence's hands were doing at the observation station. He wrote, I wish to bring the attention of the High Command to the incident on Yaren 4, and, in particular, the human reaction to it. I have been studying humans for 30 years. I have seen them react to loss before. I have seen them grieve, and I have seen them take revenge. And I have seen them negotiate based on grief. And I have seen them use grief as a tactical position. What I observed in Colonel Vance's transmission does not fall into any of these cases. I am not sure that I have a category for this. I request the High Command to treat this incident seriously, not as a military incident, but as something else. I cannot say yet exactly what. He sent the message. He leaned back in his chair. On the field at Yaren 4, someone finally removed the ceasefire flag. It had flown for 4 hours after the last shot, long enough that the light had changed. The sickly yellow color of the sky had thickened. The plane had turned from rusty to dark brown in the shadow of the evening. 41 names written in field reports on both sides in different languages and under different headings. On the Vreth side, future threat eliminated. On the human side, names. Just names in a column. Nothing else, no notes, no status. The column was simply called Ours. The field was quiet, the flag had been removed, and stars had begun to appear over Yaren 4, which had no real name and had never been beautiful, and it became what all worthless places eventually become when enough people die on them. A place. A line. A word that had not yet been spoken but was already hovering in the air, already forming in hundreds of different mouths across 6 star systems, moving toward the moment when someone would say it out loud, reckoning. It was a human word. Most species did not have an exact translation, not because the concept was alien to them, but because they had never had to give it such weight. They had never had to give it such meaning as humans did when they spoke it. Night fell on Yaren 4. Nobody slept on either side of the border. In the human command shelter, Sarah Vance sat with the list of 41 names and read them until she had memorized each one. It took most of the night. She had a good memory. She had always had a good memory. She considered it her duty now to have a perfect memory. She said nothing as she read, only the names, quietly to herself in the dark. When she finished, she began again from the very beginning. The recording reached Earth in 11 hours. It passed through the relay network that humans had built across the outer systems over 4 decades of space travel, a chain of signal amplifiers stretching from the inner colonies back to the home planet itself, like a long wire connecting everything they had built there to the place where they had begun. 11 hours was fast. It was as fast as physics allowed. By the time it arrived, the Military Intelligence Directorate had already received Colonel Vance's initial report and the recording from the Commonwealth observer Lorescence, which the Commonwealth had passed through a neutral relay station as part of standard ceasefire documentation. The Lorescence recording was even clearer than the human sides, at a better angle, with better resolution. She had been well positioned. The Intelligence Department processed the recording. Johnny, a senior analyst, watched it once, stopped it, sat for a minute, and then went straight to the office of General Harut Matse, chief of the UN Military Command, and said, "You just need to see this now." General Matse watched. He was 61 years old. He had close-cropped white hair and a face that had long ago learned to show nothing while others were around. He watched the recording from beginning to end without saying a word. When it finished, he said, "Play it again." The analyst played it again. When it finished a second time, he said, "Bring me the Secretary General." The Secretary General watched it 30 minutes later. By the next morning, it had been seen by 22 heads of state and colonial governors. By the next evening, it had been seen by everyone who needed to see it, and a few people who didn't need to, but who got it anyway, because information travels just like light. It doesn't ask for your permission before it goes anywhere. The UN Military Council was convened for an emergency meeting. Ambassador Dalhari 7 had a pass to observe military council meetings. He had had it for 6 years. He had used it many times. He was, as he told his staff, a scientist, and scientists observe. He arrived early and sat in the observer's gallery above the main hall. The hall below was filling up. He watched as the human delegates entered from Earth nations, from outer colonies, from orbital stations where signal lag meant some of them were watching through screens with a few seconds of delay between what was said and what they heard. He noted how they moved. He studied the humans' bodies as a good observer should, not just their words. The human delegates moved differently than usual. He had attended many such meetings. Usually, there was a certain kind of what he had learned to identify as political theater, the way people sat, the conversations they had with each other before the meeting began, the posturing. Today, none of that was there. They entered and sat down. They spoke little to each other. They looked at the floor of the hall in front of them. Like soldiers, Dalhari 7 thought. They moved like soldiers, even those who had never been soldiers. There was something different in their behavior. He made neat notes. The meeting opened. The Secretary General, a woman named Adiza Obi, stood at the head of the hall. She was a small woman with a large presence, the kind who made the room she was in feel like her own. She had grown up in Lagos and had spent 30 years in politics before this job, and she had the look of a person whom people had disappointed many times. And she had come to terms with that, never quite forgiving them. She did not give a speech. She said, "You have all seen the recording. I have nothing to add to what you have already seen. The question before this council, how will we respond? I yield the floor." She stepped back. The floor was yielded. The first to speak was the delegate from the Martian colonies. His name was Tari Kosai, and he was known for his long, cautious speeches that considered all sides of an issue before arriving at any conclusion. He stood up and spoke 4 words. "This is unacceptable." Then he sat down. The delegate from the European Federation stood up. She said, "I support this position." She sat down. This was unusual. The military council did not work that way. The military council worked through arguments and counter-arguments, amendments, and the slow, agonizing process of reaching agreement between people who did not naturally agree. Dalhari 7 had observed this for 6 years. He had always been intrigued. Today, he was doing something different. He wrote in his notes, "They are not arguing. They are confirming what they have already decided. This is a meeting of a different kind." One by one, the delegates spoke. Some spoke more than others. The representative from the orbital stations gave a short speech about the Geneva Convention. Dalhari 7 quickly found the reference in his notes and accurately cited several of its articles. The delegate from the Kepler colony spoke for about 2 minutes on a concept she called the protected class, clearly explaining it for the record. Although it was clearly understood by everyone in the room, the delegate from the Pacific Coalition said nothing, simply stood up when it was his turn, nodded, and sat back down. That nod was counted as a vote. The vote, when it was cast, was unanimous. Dalhari 7 sat in the observer's gallery and looked at his notes. Unanimous. He checked the records on his screen. The last unanimous vote in the UN Military Council had been 31 years ago on the issue of evacuating civilians from a collapsing colonial station. Before that, one had to go back even further. Unanimous votes were not the human way, they argued. They always argued. He had always considered human arguments one of their most defining characteristics, the way they could find disagreement in everything, the way no two of them ever seemed to want the same thing. Today, they wanted the same thing. He left the gallery quickly after the vote. He needed to send a message. The vote was not a declaration of war. The war was already ongoing. It had been ongoing for 11 years. The vote was about something else, something that had no simple name in most languages, including human, but had an official designation in the Military Council Protocol. Protocol Nemesis, which was Latin, an ancient Earth language that humans used mostly for naming things they wanted to sound important or permanent. Dalhari 7 knew what Nemesis meant. He had studied human history and mythology enough to know exactly what they had named it. He found a corner of the corridor outside the hall and wrote his message to the Commonwealth High Command. He wrote quickly, which was unusual for him. Usually he was careful with his words, but there was a feeling in his chest that defied his usual caution. He wrote, "I wish to bring to the attention of the High Command the vote of the Military Council, which was unanimous. The first unanimous vote in 31 years. They have authorized what they call Protocol Nemesis. I want to be perfectly clear regarding what this means. This is not an escalation. An escalation is an increased version of what was already happening. This is a different category of things. For the last 30 years, I have studied humans in detail. I have studied their wars. The wars they fought against each other before they had space travel and the wars they have fought since. I have noticed something in this history that I want to share now. Humans have a specific attitude toward one specific category of actions: the killing of protected persons, the wounded, the healers, those who have surrendered. Other species have this to some degree, but humans have built documents around it. They have written it into law. They have died to protect it. When this line is crossed, something happens in them that is not like their other reactions to attack, damage, or murder. I cannot find a purely scientific word for this. The closest human word I can find: they become purposeful. Not evil, not frightened, not strategically purposeful, as a river becomes purposeful when you remove a dam. I recommend the High Command immediately take the following actions. He listed the actions. They were reasonable, diplomatic, the kind a 30-year expert on human relations would recommend in a crisis. He sent the message. He leaned back in his chair. In the corridor, he thought about the hall, about how the delegates moved, about the unanimous vote. He thought about rivers. In the weeks following the vote, the signals began to change. Commonwealth intelligence services tracked military transmissions, as all intelligence services did. Not always the content, but the pattern, the frequency, the codes, how a fleet moves before it moves. And they had tracked human military signals for 11 years and had learned to read the patterns well enough to make predictions that were on average about 70% accurate. The predictions stopped working. The signals changed. Not the content. The content was still encoded and required time to break. The codes themselves changed. The classification systems changed. Ships that had broadcast standard fleet movement codes for years switched to a set of codes that Commonwealth analysts had never seen before. The analysts worked on it. They made progress. They cracked enough within 2 weeks to read the classification at the top of every transmission. The classification was one word. They translated it carefully, checking 3 different databases of human languages to ensure they understood correctly. The word was punitive. The lead analyst brought this to the Commonwealth High Military Command in person, which was unusual. She was a cautious and quiet woman who usually sent reports through standard channels. She came in person because she believed the report should be delivered by a human, not a screen. She explained the new codes. She explained the new classification. She placed the translation on the table. She said, "I want the command to understand what this word means in context. Punitive does not mean strategic. It does not mean the goal is territory resource, or tactical advantage. Punitive means the action is an end in itself. Punitive means the goal is the action itself. The admiral of the Commonwealth High Military Command, a Vreth named Pharos, looked at the word on the table. He said, "Okay, they are doing this for show. It is psychological." The analyst carefully said, "I don't think that is correct." Admiral Pharos said, "Then what, in your opinion, is it?" She thought for a moment. She had a good answer. She had been building it in her head for the last few days while she worked with the signals, while she watched the fleet movement pattern, while she read everything she could find about the Geneva Convention and the Military Council vote and the history of what humans did when they used this specific classification. She said, "I believe they are no longer trying to win the war." Pharos looked at her. "They changed the question," she said. "The war was about territory, about containing human expansion. That was the question we were all answering. They have put that question aside. Now they are answering a different question." "Which one?" She looked at the word on the table. "What will happen to the people who gave the order on Yaren 4, she said. "That is the question they are answering. Only that question, until it is answered." The room was silent. She added, "I want to note for the record that this is not what we modeled. For 11 years of conflict analysis, we have not built a model for this scenario. I have no forecast for it. I want the High Command to understand that I cannot tell you what will happen next because we have no data set for this. We have never encountered this before." Ambassador Dalhari 7 received the High Command's response to his message 4 days after he sent it. The response was short. It stated that his analysis had become biased due to proximity. It was implied that he had spent too much time among humans and could no longer evaluate them objectively, that humans were a capable but fundamentally limited species, with strong stamina and a history of emotional decision-making that rarely yielded long-term strategic advantage, that the Commonwealth had managed human expansion for 11 years and understood the parameters well, and that he should report to the nearest transit point for reassignment. He read the message twice. He thought about the military council hall, about how the delegates moved, about how the vote had gone. He thought about rivers. He thought about the word purposeful. He thought about an excerpt from a human historical text he had read many years ago from a period of their history when they were still waging wars on one planet. The text described a specific phase of a specific war. He couldn't remember it all. He remembered one line. He had thought it was poetic when he first read it. Metaphorical. The kind of language humans used when they wanted history to sound dramatic. Now he thought about it, and it no longer seemed like a metaphor to him. The line read, "There is a kind of anger that does not burn hot, it burns cold. Cold things live longer than hot ones. Cold is patient. The most dangerous soldiers in any war are those who are angry. These are those who have moved past anger to something quiet." He sent a reply to the High Command. He said he would depart on the next flight. He began packing his things. He had lived in this apartment for 6 years. He had many books, physical books, which he preferred to screens because you cannot highlight on a screen the way you can on a page. He began packing them into crates. He worked slowly because there were many of them. He stopped at one of the books on human history. He stood for a moment, holding it. Then he placed it in the crate with the others. He returned home to Dalhara Prime and explained to no one who asked why he had requested reassignment. And he gave no interviews to the media that contacted him after the war entered its new phase. He sat at home and watched what would happen next from a distance, and nothing surprised him. And he discovered that the absence of surprise was the loneliest feeling he had ever experienced. The last thing that changed in those first weeks was something small, simple, a trifle that one could have missed if one weren't paying close attention. The human fleet in the Yaren system. The ships that had held the border for 11 years, exchanging territory with Commonwealth forces at the slow, grueling pace of this war, began to move not toward Commonwealth territory, not in a formation created for seizing and holding land. They were moving in small groups, traveling quickly in patterns that Commonwealth tracking systems could not predict because the patterns were not built for prediction. They were built for something else. A Commonwealth signals officer observing the movement patterns from a station at the edge of the Yaren system was trying to map what the humans were doing. She worked on it for several days. She overlaid the fleet movement onto star charts, searching for strategic logic. She could not find it. Then she tried to overlay the movement onto something else, the Vreth military command structure, the chain of command that operated on Yaren 4 on the day of the massacre, the list of ships and commanders who were part of the operation. She immediately found a pattern. She sat with it for a long time. She checked the overlay 3 more times to be sure. Then she filed her report. She wrote it in careful, professional language. She described what she had found. She noted the implications. She recommended the Commonwealth High Military Command immediately review this data. At the bottom of the report, in the additional observations section, she wrote one sentence that was not professional language. She wrote it, nevertheless, because she couldn't miss it. She wrote, "They know exactly who gave the order. They know exactly who transmitted it. They know exactly who was there. I don't know how they know it, but they know it. And they are going for all those people, one by one. And I cannot find anything in our response capabilities that could stop them." She sent the report. Outside the station windows, the stars were very still and very cold, as they had always been. As they had always been. The sky had not changed, but something in it was now moving purposefully, like a river from which the dam had been removed. Quietly, like cold, patiently, like things that have already decided. Humans were making a list, and they had started at the very top. The first prisoners returned 2 weeks after the vote. There were 30 of them. Vreth soldiers captured during a skirmish near the second planet of the Yaren system, captured in combat, versions of which both sides had been waging for years. Small skirmishes along the border, battles that killed dozens, not thousands. Under normal war conditions, they would have been detained, documented, eventually exchanged as part of a prisoner swap. The Commonwealth was preparing for this process. They began documentation on their side. They identified the soldiers, recorded their units and ranks, opened the standard prisoner file that the system required. The soldiers were returned before the file was completed. 30 Vreth soldiers arrived back at a Commonwealth border station on a transport with medical symbols. They were in good condition, better than expected given the battle in which they were captured. Someone had treated their wounds. Someone had fed them. All 30 arrived with the same item, a small data chip, sealed, given to each of them individually. The transport included a short message, no signature, no official heading, just text. "These soldiers are returned without conditions. The chips are for them, not for you. Please ensure they receive them." The border station commander, a Cellin officer named Doritwin, examined the returned prisoners, checked their condition, verified that they were who the human records claimed. He noted that none of them appeared to be wounded beyond combat injuries. He noted the chips. He flagged them for analysis before distribution. His analytical team cracked the chip encryption in less than an hour, which was easy because the chips were not encrypted to keep humans out. They were simply sealed against moisture and radiation. Inside each was one file, one video recording, Yaren 4. Doritwin watched the recording. He had heard of it. He had read the reports. Hearing of something and watching a recording of it are different things, and he came to terms with that difference. Sometime after the recording ended, he thought about the instruction in the human message, "The chips are for them, not for you." He ordered the chips issued to the 30 soldiers, as the humans had requested. He filed an incident report. In the observations section, he wrote, "I have no strategic analysis I can offer. I'm not sure this is a strategic action. I'm not sure what kind of action this is." High Admiral Serena Boss of the Cellin Naval Forces received Doritwin's report among 40 others that week, and she almost missed it. She had the kind of job where important things hid in piles of other things, and she had learned to read quickly and sort quickly and identify what required her full attention versus what required a response versus what just needed to be filed. She was reading the stack on Wednesday when she stumbled upon Doritwin's report and stopped. She read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she returned to her records and pulled all the reports on human actions for the 3 weeks since the Military Council vote. Everything. She had a large screen on one wall of her office, and she displayed everything on it. Fleet movements, combat reports, signal logs, the return of the prisoners. Every piece of data her intelligence department had gathered on what humans had done since Yaren 4. She stood by her screen for most of the day. Serena Boss, by her own estimation and by the estimation of most others, was the best strategic military mind the galaxy had produced in 2 generations. She had won battles others thought impossible. She understood war the way some people understand mathematics, not just the rules, but the feeling, the shape, the way a situation has a correct answer that can be recognized if you have the right mind. She was rarely surprised by anything. That she was rarely surprised by anything was a trait of her mind she was most proud of. Now she was surprised. Humans were not seizing territory. For 11 years of war, the struggle had always been for territory. The map moved back and forth, little by little. It was the fundamental logic of the conflict. You take, they retake. You both take elsewhere, the line moves. It was an understandable type of war. She had built her entire strategic model on that. They had put the map aside. She saw it in the movements. Fleets were not positioning for territorial control. They were not building supply lines. They were not creating strongholds. They were moving like something that didn't care about the land at all. Moving like a target, not an army. She found the pattern, like Doritwin's analyst, by accident, and then suddenly all at once, she overlaid the movement onto the Vreth command structure and the list of ships and commanders who were part of Yaren 4. She stared at the result. They were hunting specifically, carefully, methodically hunting the people responsible for giving and executing the order on Yaren 4. Not the Vreth species, not the Vreth military as a whole. A specific chain of command, specific individuals. The humans apparently had gotten the full report of who was involved. They had a list. They were working through it. She had been in a command position for 22 years. She had studied the approaches to war of 60 different civilizations as part of her strategic education. She had a library of case studies on how different species react to different provocations. She was very well educated on this issue. She did not have a case study for this. She sat at her desk and wrote her analysis. She was honest in it, which was her habit, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She wrote, "Humans apparently have two concepts, both of which translate to our word justice. One is the version we are familiar with, balance, proportion, restoration of a disturbed state. The other is something else. The closest translation I can find in our language is roughly reckoning for a debt that cannot be left unpaid. They have a word for this in one of their oldest languages, reckoning. I believe we should have learned this word before we reached this moment." She sent the analysis to the High Council of the Universe and requested an urgent session. The Commonwealth was not a unified government. It was an alliance. There was a difference. A government could make a decision, and it was executed. An alliance made a decision, and then watched as its members decided whether they really wanted to do it, which was a slower and more irritating process. The Keth were the first to move. The Keth are a species from a cold, rocky system in the center of Commonwealth territory. They were not the largest or most powerful of the 4 Commonwealth species. They were thoughtful and methodical, and they had a long memory, which was the most important quality right now. 800 years ago, they had almost destroyed themselves in a civil war that began the way civil wars begin, with a list of grievances that constantly grew. The war had reached a point where no one took prisoners, no one treated wounds, and no one allowed the dead to be collected. There was a word for what had happened to a society that stopped doing these things. The Keth still teach that word in their schools. The Keth ambassador to the Commonwealth, Oren Saul, requested a formal session with the Commonwealth Military Committee 1 week after Cyrena Boss sent her analysis. She arrived with a short statement. She read it without preamble. She said, "The Republic of Keth officially distances itself from the Commonwealth military position on the Yaren incident. We do not support the actions taken. We never supported them. We want to clearly state for the record that we were not informed before the action was taken and we were not consulted. We want to be equally clear about what we believe this action was. It was a violation of the protected class. We have a word for this in Keth. It predates our space age. It means the removal of a being from war. When a being is removed from war through wounding or surrender or an act of healing, it is no longer part of the war. Killing it is not a military act. It is something else. We do not participate in something else. We request immediate bilateral ceasefire negotiations with human forces and are withdrawing our ships from the Yaren border." After this, the meeting was unpleasant. Vreth Admiral Pharos argued that the Keth were surrendering under pressure, that this was exactly what the humans wanted, that the split in the Commonwealth was a strategic goal of the whole operation. Oren Saul calmly said, "I am doing this not because of human strategy. I am doing this because of what happened on that field." She left. The Dahari followed the Keth 6 days later. Their reasons were different. The Dahari were more pragmatic, more focused on long-term positioning, but the result was the same. They contacted the human command. They requested negotiations. They sent their ships home. The flagship of the Donaha de Vetra, the Vreth Ascendant, was one of the largest ships in the Commonwealth fleet, 14 kilometers from bow to stern. It had been in service for 30 years and had participated in 4 major battles and had never been defeated. It was the ship on which Sub-Executor Vreth had commanded the operation on Yaren 4. It was his ship. He had served on it for most of his military career. A Commonwealth patrol discovered it drifting in the Keth corridor on Tuesday morning. The captain of the patrol ship approached cautiously. No distress signal had been sent. No visible artillery fire had occurred. The ship was intact, all 14 kilometers. Every plating was in place. Every weapons system was turned off. No signs of a breach or strike. It was simply drifting like something that had forgotten it was supposed to go somewhere. However, the captain, by standard procedure, requested permission to board. He received no answer. He boarded. The ship was fully crewed. Every crew member was at their post or in their cabins. All of them were dead. No traces of violence that the primary inspection could find. No signs of a hull breach. No environmental failure that could explain it. Just the entire crew of one of the largest warships of the Commonwealth fleet dead, untouched, as if they had simply ceased to exist. Vreth was found in his command chair on the bridge. He was looking at the captain who was boarding, almost peacefully, which was the part the captain found hardest to include in his report, because peacefully is not a word that should be contained in a report. And he was a professional, and he tried to write professionally. But he included it because he was also honest, and the record must contain what was there. The exterior of the ship was painted. The captain hadn't noticed it upon approaching because the color matched the ship's hull at a distance, but up close, it was visible. Full hull markings in paint that, as his scanner showed, was designed to survive in a vacuum and radiation for approximately 3,000 years. Represented were all the major Commonwealth languages and 17 human languages. And the message was the same in all of them, translated but consistent. He read it. He read it twice. He included it in his report verbatim. This is what happens when you kill the wounded. The report was immediately sent up the chain. It reached the Commonwealth High Command within hours. It reached the Solon High Council, the remaining Vreth Command, and several independent news agencies that were located near the border systems almost simultaneously. The news agencies published it. The galaxy read it. Serena Boss was having breakfast when the report arrived. She stopped eating. She read the report carefully. She set her fork down and did not pick it up again. She thought about the Vreth Ascendant. She thought about a 14-kilometer warship, fully crewed, found drifting with no signs of battle. She thought about what it meant tactically to be able to do this, to find a ship of that size, captured or breached, or whatever had happened, and leave no traces, no evidence, no collisions visible in the sensor logs. Humans had been in this war for 11 years. She had always evaluated them honestly, which meant she evaluated them as able. They had strong stamina, good adaptability, emotional stability better than expected in working under constant pressure. She thought she understood what they were capable of. She thought again about the ship. 3,000 years. That is how long the paint was intended to last. They hadn't painted it for today. They had painted it for everyone who would come after. They had painted it for the ships, explorers, and civilizations that would pass through the Keth corridor in centuries, in 5 centuries, in 2,000 years. They were leaving a message not for the Commonwealth, they were leaving it for the future. She picked up her communicator and contacted her assistant. She said, "Connect me directly with Human Command. Whoever is in charge of this operation, I want to speak with them." Her assistant said, "Admiral, this is outside protocol. We will need permission from." "I authorize it," she said. "Give me the channel." That day, she did not get the channel. It took 3 more days of navigating communication protocols. A cautious and irritating process of establishing contact between 2 sides that were technically still at war, while 2 of the 4 Commonwealth races were now technically not at war, with the same people, and the lines were becoming tangled. While she waited, she continued working on her analysis. She continued collecting reports. She continued adding to the picture she was building. The pattern she had noticed in the first week had now become clearer. Humans were returning prisoners. Every Commonwealth soldier captured after the vote had been processed, healed if wounded, and returned without conditions, with a chip every time. Initially, she thought this was a message, a demonstration, a way to say, "We will fight you, but we will not be like you." Now she thought about it more carefully. She thought about it the way she thought about military actions, not as communication, but as design. What did this give? What did this do to the person who received it? 30 Vreth soldiers returned. each with a recording of Yaren 4. No judicial pressure to watch it. Not obligated. Just given. Handed over. This is what your side did. We want you to see it. She thought about the 30 soldiers. She thought about how they returned home and lived with this chip in their possession, with a recording on it, the knowledge that humans had held them and could have done anything, but instead fed them, healed them, and sent them back. She thought about what this did to the understanding of the war they were waging to the soldiers. This, she realized, was the most sophisticated thing she had seen from either side in 11 years. It wasn't violence. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a question delivered to 30 people. And the question was, do you know what you are a part of? She added a new section to her analysis. She named it Observations on Human Strategic Patience. She wrote, I am trying to understand what humans are doing and why it works, what our standard models cannot explain. I believe the answer lies in the fact that humans are not acting within a strategy at all. They are acting within a moral framework. This is not the same thing. Moral frameworks are not interested in efficiency. Moral frameworks are interested in being right. An enemy acting within a moral framework does not ask what action is most efficient. He asks what action is right. This is harder to predict, harder to counter, and harder to exhaust. Efficiency can be exhausted. You cannot exhaust a species that sincerely believes as a group, not as propaganda, as a real belief that they are doing what must be done. She paused. She read what she had written. She added another line. I have studied war all my adult life. And I will honestly tell you that I never wanted to be on the wrong side of this particular type of enemy. The Vreth put us on the wrong side on Yaren 4. I am going to fix this. She sent the analysis to the council. She returned to waiting for the opening of her channel. Outside the window, somewhere in the darkness between systems, humans were still moving, patient, quiet, and cold, like things when they have already decided and all that is left is to do. Working through the list, one name at a time. The meeting was set at a station called Meridian Point. It was an old structure built in the early days of human space travel, when first contact with other species was still new enough to be exciting, before the Commonwealth decided that excitement was something to be managed and contained. Meridian Point was a trading station, then a diplomatic center, then a kind of neutral gathering place for anyone who needed to talk to someone on the other side of a dispute. It wasn't beautiful. It was large, functional, and slightly worn, like things that many different species have passed through over the years. High Admiral Sirena Boss arrived at the diplomatic shuttle alone, except for 2 assistants and a personal security officer whom she told to stay outside the meeting room. She was not afraid of the meeting. She feared little. And what she feared, she had long ago learned to put aside. She arrived exactly on time. General Admiral Tobias Vren arrived 2 minutes early, which Serena Boss noted and saved as information. He was a large man, broad-shouldered like people who had done physical labor in their youth and had retained some of that physique. Even when age had changed other things, he had graying dark hair and a face that had acquired the look of constant steadiness, as happens with faces when a person in them has not allowed the face to do what it wants for a long time. He stood when she entered. She also noted this. In war, trifles spoke of the large, if you were paying attention. She sat down. He sat down. The assistants sat at the edges of the room. Between her and Vren stood a long, simple table on which there was water, which neither of them touched for a long time. She had prepared opening remarks, diplomatic positions, language that established parameters before the real conversation began. She had carefully written it. She looked at it for a moment and put it aside. I will skip the preliminary part, she said. I have been in enough such rooms to know when it is useful and when it is not. I think today it is not useful. He said, agreed. She said, is there anything we can give you that will stop this before not a single Vreth remains? This was the question she had been moving toward for weeks. This was the question beneath every one of her analyses. She asked it directly, because directness was the right tool here. He paused for a moment. She watched his face, which expressed almost nothing. She thought of everything she had written about humans and moral frameworks, and the difference between strategic patience and this other thing, and watched his face. He was thinking of something. She couldn't say what. He was thinking of the 41 names. He thought of them every morning. He began doing this after Yaren 4, when he first received Colonel Vance's report. He read the names and decided to memorize them because there had to be someone at the command post who knew them all, and because it seemed like the right form of discipline, not dramatic, not ritualistic, just a habit of mind, a small insistence that they were people, not numbers. Private Dara Ohan, her brother Kenji, Medic First Class Yusuf Abara, Corpsman Lena Marchetti. In total, 23 medics and 18 wounded soldiers who lay on the field under the ceasefire flag. He knew their rank, their colony of origin, their years of service. He read their personnel files. He read some of their letters home with the permission of their families because he wanted to know who they were, not just what they were. He thought of Dara Ohan, 19 years old, who lay in a crater for 6 hours waiting to be found, who was found by her brother, who died anyway because the flag that was supposed to mean something meant nothing to those who held the other side. He looked at Sirena Boss and said to her, "The Vreth High Command, the officers in the chain of command from Vral down, all of them. Whoever gave the order transmitted it or executed it on Yaren 4. All of them. We want them handed over." Sirena Boss said, "To trial? To trial," he said, "by human law, by human judges, using the Geneva Convention as the legal basis." "The Geneva Convention," she said. He watched as she said it. He had expected this. "It is a human document from a millennium ago." "Yes," he said. "You are asking us to recognize human law as applicable for crimes against human wounded under a ceasefire flag on a contested human moon." "Yes, human law, human court, human judges." She paused. She considered this. He gave her time because it was a serious question, and she was a serious person. And she had asked him a direct question and deserved for him to ask a direct question in response. She said, "And the war?" "The war will end," he said. "When the trial ends. The war will end. We will return to the negotiating table. We will agree on something new, something real. The Keth and Dahari have already left," she said. "I know. The Solon and Vreth remain. I know." She watched him intently. "The Vreth High Command will refuse. You understand that? They will not agree to a transfer to a human court. That is the Vreth's decision," he said, "and the Solon's decision. What happens after that depends on those decisions." She heard what he did not say. She knew how to do that. She had known how to do that for a long time. She said, "And if we refuse? And the Commonwealth? If we say no?" He looked at her for a moment. His face was still. "Then we will finish the list," he said. 3 words: quiet, direct, and final. Like everything she had ever heard in such a room. Not a threat spoken by force, anger, or spectacle. Just a fact stated by a person who had already decided he was truthful. She had studied war all her adult life. She had been in rooms where threats were made, and she knew the difference between the presentation of a threat, which was common, and the thing itself. The thing itself was rarer. She had heard it a few times. It did not sound like what most people thought. It did not sound loud. It sounded like this. She said, "I believe you." He said, "I know." They looked at each other. She said, "How much time do you need? Give me time." "We will not stop while you are taking it," he said. "The operation is ongoing. Do you understand that?" "I understand. How much time?" She thought of the Vreth High Command. She thought of their politics, their internal structure, how decisions moved through their leadership. She thought of the casualty projections she had seen, of the fleet's strength, of the rate of decline of Vreth, military potential under the human operation. She conducted the mathematical calculations in her head quickly and without much fanfare. As always, she said, 3 weeks. He nodded once. She stood up. He stood up. She reached out her hand across the table, which was a human gesture she had learned many years ago. He shook it. She left. Her assistants followed her. In the corridor outside, one of them said quietly, "Admiral, what did you agree to?" She said, "So far, nothing." She paused. "But we will agree." The session of the Vreth High Command lasted 9 days. Sirena Boss was not present. No Solons were present, because the Vreth were dealing with their internal affairs. She received reports from her intelligence contacts, summaries, and fragments, enough to trace the shape of the argument without its details. The argument was not whether Yaren 4 could be wrong. The Vreth did not have an accurate framework where this would be wrong. It was practical, efficient. The Vreth produced a calculation and acted on it. That is what commanders do. The Vreth understanding of war was built on the idea of total commitment. You eliminate threats when you can. The wounded were a future threat. The math was clean. When the argument was about whether all this mattered now, it was a young admiral, as Sirena Boss said the contact informed her, who finally articulated it in a way the session could work with. The admiral's name was Shar, no relation, and she had served in the Yaren battle for 4 years and knew human military culture well enough to develop a special respect for them. She said, supposedly standing in the middle of the session that had gone in circles for days, "We are not arguing about honor. We are not arguing about law. We are not arguing about whether Yaren 4 was correct under our own doctrine. I am telling you that the question before this command is one question. Can we survive what is coming without giving them what they asked for? That is the question. Can we survive this?" There was a pause in the session. Someone asked for casualty projections. Projections were displayed. The session was quiet for some time. They transferred 43 people. The transfer occurred at Meridian Point 1 2 days after the meeting between Serena Boss and Vreth. 3 days before the deadline, Serena Boss had requested to accelerate because she wanted the humans to see that this was not a reluctant agreement executed at the last moment. She wanted them to see it as a decision. The 43 people included Vreth, who of course was not there for the transfer. His name was on the list as proof, not as an accused. The others were members of the chain of command, from the officers planning the operation to the soldiers executing the orders. 42 living people and 1 name on the official indictment. Vreth received the transfer. Serena Boss stood beside him during the processing, which she had asked to do and he had agreed to without discussion. She stood there because she wanted the transferred people to see how the Solan Admiral stood among humans. She wanted that image to be captured. When processing was complete and the last 42 people were taken into custody, Vreth looked at her and said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Write something that means this will not happen again." He said, "That is the second conversation." She said, "Then let's have it." The second conversation happened in the same room, at the same table, but took several days, not one. They were joined by the Keth ambassador and a Dahari representative. Both asked to be included. The Vreth sent an observer, a junior diplomat who had no authority to agree to anything, which everyone understood was the Vreth's way of being present without being committed. They talked about the Geneva Convention. Vreth brought a physical copy, real paper, an old one, the type of document that had been reissued so many times from its original that this version was a copy of a copy of a copy, but printed neatly and handled with something like respect. He placed it on the table. Serena Boss read it. The Keth ambassador Oren Sol read it slowly, often pausing, and once said, "We have something similar. Ours is longer. Is yours simpler?" He said, "Simplicity was the goal." She said, "Yes, I see." The Dahari representative, a pragmatic being named Harat II, read it quickly and said, "The first part. It is about the protection of non-combatants." Vreth said, "Yes." Harat II said, "We can agree with this in principle." Vreth said, "I need more than a principle." Harat II said, "I know, that is what these few days are for." Serena Boss said on the second day, "There is the question of enforcement. What is the mechanism if a party violates this?" The room was quiet. She said, "Because the mechanism we relied on before was goodwill, and as we have seen, goodwill is not enough," Oren Sol replied. She said, "The mechanism is this room. Any civilization that signs agrees to hold every other signatory accountable. A violation is met not by one side, but by all signatories." Vreth said, "That is Article 1, as I understand it." Oren Sol said, "Yes, Article 1. The wounded are beyond the reach of war, and any civilization that cannot respect this will answer to every civilization that can." She looked around the room. "This is what we didn't have before. Joint guarantee. Humans had a rule. The Commonwealth had a rule. Nobody had a guarantee." The Vreth observer said nothing. On the fourth day, Vreth said, "There is something else." He said it during a pause in the general discussion, quietly, without preparation. Serena Boss looked at him. 41 names, he said. "I want them to be in the treaty as the reason for it, not as a historical footnote, as the stated reason. The document must state who it was written for." The room was quiet, and Oren Sol said, "Agreed." Harat II said, "Agreed." Serena Boss looked at the table for a moment. She thought of the field on Yaren 4, where she had never been and had only seen through the recording. The rusty brown earth, the ceasefire flag that continued to fly. She said, "Agreed." The Vreth observer left on the fourth day and sent an official note on the fifth that the Vreth Republic was unable to participate in negotiations at this time. The note was polite and said nothing about the future. Vreth read the note in his room at the station. He sat with it for some time. He thought about what the operation was doing now, which he tracked every morning the way other commanders tracked casualties. The list, the progress on it, the work that still remained. He wondered if the Vreth would return. He thought they would return not because he wanted to believe it, but because he had read their history, the same way a good commander reads all available information about an opponent. And he knew that the Vreth were a species that made calculations. They had made a bad calculation on Yaren 4. They had made an even worse one in the weeks after, failing to understand what humans would do. They were now calculating seriously with the focus that catastrophe produces in a species that prefers to live. He thought they would return and sign. He thought it would take another 6 months of operation before they returned. He was wrong by 3 weeks. They returned after 7 months with a new high command. The old command had stood trial in the court that had been created 6 months from the time of the transfer, and the delegate who had actual authority and a very short statement which said essentially, "How are we? We are ready to sign. We understand what we are signing." He was in the signing room. When they signed, he stood behind and watched as each delegation placed its seal on the document. He watched everything. He thought about the 41 names. He thought about the girl in the crater, 19 years old, waiting to be found. He thought about the brother who found her. He thought about the medic who made the colonel laugh, treating her hairline rib fracture, and how the pain from the laugh was worth it. He thought about all of them, one by name, as he did every morning. He did not let his face do what it wanted. He was a commander. People were watching him. He held it still and watched as the seals descended on the oldest and newest thing in the room. Thus, what had been written in human blood 400 years ago on a planet that had not yet looked at the stars by humans who had just finished doing terrible things to each other and decided after that to write a line and call it a limit. The signatures were placed. The line held. The trial lasted 14 months. It took place on Earth in a city called The Hague, which had a long habit of being the place where humanity brought its most difficult questions and tried to answer them before witnesses. The city was old and quiet, and had a way of making everything that happened in its legal buildings feel permanent, as if the stones themselves were paying attention and keeping records. The 42 defendants were held in secure facilities that, by any fair standard, seemed more comfortable than what most of their accusers had experienced in the field. They had rooms, not cells. They had access to legal help, to food meeting their nutritional needs, to air outside, and to enclosed courtyards at designated times. In the initial days of trial preparation, there were debates about this. Some people said the accused deserved something harder, something less comfortable. The lawyer of the world, Osei, the lead prosecutor chosen for this position after a long process that included many arguments in numerous rooms, simply said, "The whole point is that we treat those who surrender with dignity. The point is that we are not them." The debate ended. The trial was broadcast. Every session was fully transmitted to every relay station in the known human network, and from there transmitted through the various signal agreements developed in the month after the treaty to every inhabited system in Commonwealth territory. The Keth picked it up and retransmitted it across their networks. The Dahari did the same. Even in Vreth space, where the official position on the trial remained complex throughout most of its duration, the broadcasts were available to anyone who knew which frequency to find. The galaxy watched. Not all of it, not every single person, but enough. As enough people watched something for it to become a fact in the world, something that could no longer be denied, something that entered the general record and remained there. Lawyer of the world, Osei was 38 years old, and she had spent her legal career prosecuting war crimes in human conflicts, which were rarer than before but had not yet completely ceased. She was from a city on the west coast of South America, and grew up in a family where her mother was a judge and her father taught legal history. And she had absorbed the law the way children absorb things when it is simply the air of the home, not as a subject, but as a way of seeing. She prepared for the trial for 8 months before the opening of the first session. She read everything. The recording of Yaren 4, everything. Every angle, every report, every piece of human history having relevance to the charges. She read the Geneva Convention so many times she could quote any article from any page. She also read the legal tradition of the Vreth, the various Commonwealth frameworks for military behavior, and every expert witness testimony she could gather about how each of the 4 Commonwealth species thought about war. She entered the courtroom on the first day and felt its weight, which was appropriate because it was a heavy case, and the weight was the right response. The accused sat in the area to the left of the main floor. 42 beings. Most of them Vreth, one junior Solon officer who had been part of the communication chain confirming the order. They had legal representation, as was their right. Their legal representatives in the pre-trial phase argued about jurisdiction, about applicable law, about whether a human document could serve as a legal basis for actions taken by non-human military officers under the command of an alien military structure. However, Osei answered all of this in writing in briefs that the presiding judges found sufficient to continue. The key argument was simple. The victims were human. The ceasefire flag was a human system. The protection that was violated was the protection that the human side had offered in goodwill in accordance with the agreement signed by both sides. The applicable law was the law that covered the victims. The court's jurisdiction followed from this. The trial was not a drama. Real legal processes rarely are. They were meticulous and slow and full of details. And the details mattered precisely because they were not dramatic. The details were the essence. This person gave this order at this time through this channel to this person who transmitted it to this person. This person fired this weapon. This person wrote this report and named it such. The record was built piece by piece, specific and small, until everything that happened on Yaren 4 was in the room in full, as much as it could be reconstructed without a place to hide. The representatives of the accused tried to use different approaches. They argued that their clients believed the actions were military, justified. They argued the absence of precedent in Vreth military law. They argued about intent. Osei answered every approach, carefully, taking her time, building her answers the way good arguments are built not by force, but by clarity. That clarity that does not allow the fog of competing claims to settle. A question came from one of the defendants directly in the third month of the trial during a session dedicated to testimony about the chain of command. One of the junior officers, a young Vreth soldier who was an armaments technician on one of the ships that carried out the Yaren 4 order, asked through his representative to speak. He was given time. He was respectful and calm. He said he wanted to understand something. He said he had thought about this since the day they returned from the operation and filed their reports even before the trial. He said he had tried to find the answer himself and couldn't. He said, "I don't understand why this is different from any other death in war. We killed humans throughout this entire conflict. Many people. Every day for 11 years you killed Vreth. That is war. Why does this specific killing require this specific answer? Why is it more important that they were wounded?" The room was quiet. The presiding judge looked at Osei. She had expected this question. Not necessarily in this form, not necessarily from the accused himself during cross-examination, but she had expected the question because it was the heart of everything. This was the question the trial was effectively answering. She stood up. She said, "Because the wounded cannot fight back. This is the first reason, and it is sufficient by itself. But I will continue, because the medics who treated them made a choice, a legal choice, recognized by both sides of this conflict, to be healers, to leave the war. When someone voluntarily leaves the war to help the fallen, they are owed safety in return. This is not a human invention. Every species represented in this hall has a version of this understanding. The Vreth have it too. You call it something else. The word roughly translates to deferred. Those who are deferred from combat are deferred from death." She paused. The room was listening. The video feeds to the relay stations were active. She said, "But I want to fully answer your question because you asked it honestly. There is a deeper reason. The ceasefire flag was flying. That flag is a human system, and it means one specific thing. War is suspended. Everything under that flag is no longer combatants. They are just people. People who are wounded. People who are trying to help the wounded. People who have set war aside and were asking only for a chance to survive, or to help others survive. What happened on Yaren 4 was not a military decision made in the heat of battle. It was a decision made in cold calculation to kill people who were no longer part of the war. Your sub-executor called it effective field neutralization of future combatants. I want that phrase noted for the record because that phrase is the entire case. He did not see people on the field. He saw future problems. He saw mathematics. And this is precisely the type of vision the document lying before this court was written to prevent. Not because humans are more valuable than other beings, but because no wounded person under a ceasefire flag is a combatant. Not human, not Vreth, not any species, ever. This is the line. She sat down. She did not explain further. She added nothing. The room absorbed what she said, and she left it there. She had learned from the document upon which she was basing her case that sometimes the right thing to do is to state your argument and then be silent and trust that the people in the room are smart enough to carry it to the end. The verdicts were delivered on Thursday. Guilty on all major charges for 38 of the 42 defendants. The remaining 4 received lighter verdicts on reduced charges, which Osei had expected. The bottom end of the chain of command was always complex, always included people who followed orders without full information, and the document had language for this distinction as well. Then followed sentencing. It was measured and specific. As sentencing should be, the harshest consequences fell on those who gave and transmitted the orders. Technical specialists received less. Everything was on the record, public, in detail. The transcript numbered several thousand pages and was entered into the permanent archive of human laws, which meant it would exist in an accessible form as long as humans maintained their record systems, which, according to current forecasts, was for a very long time. The Vreth High Command, having signed the treaty, watched the verdicts in one room, which was unusual for their process. But the request had been made, and no one objected. They watched the sentencing. They said nothing to each other for a time. Then they said what they needed to say privately. And what they said in that room was never fully reported. But the decisions made in the Vreth political process in the following months suggested that the conversation was serious. The Yaren 4 treaty was signed within 6 months of the verdicts. 37 star-faring civilizations. Not the whole galaxy. The galaxy was larger than that. And there were species in the outer arms and deep voids that humans hadn't met yet, and the Commonwealth only knew as signals and distant light. But 37 was a number that mattered. It included every species that was part of the Commonwealth. It included several that were neutral throughout the conflict. It also included those that were technically allies of neither side and had watched everything from a distance, then sent a delegation to the signing with a short message. We have read the document. We wish to sign. Article 1 was the one that mattered most, and they all signed it. The wounded are beyond the reach of war, and any civilization that cannot respect this will answer to every civilization that can. It was a human article, written by human hands 400 years ago when no human had yet left its solar system. It was a humble document, written after a catastrophic war, one of many catastrophic wars in human history. An attempt by humans who had just done terrible things to each other to draw a line and call it a limit. Now it was a galactic document. Sarah Vance retired 3 months before the treaty was signed. She had served 22 years. The last 2 were the hardest. Not because of the fighting. The fighting was mostly handled by others. Those who ran Protocol Nemesis, the planners and fleet commanders and intelligence personnel. She was a commander. She had to sign what had to be signed and accept what had to be accepted. But the weight of it was with her every day. The same weight that had been with her from the ridge on Yaren 4. She decided to retire in the month after the trial. She handed in her papers to the relevant offices and departed with the rank she had attained in a modest ceremony she had asked to be simple, and she went home. Home was a city on the coast of East Africa, warm and full of sounds, where she had grown up and where she still had a small house to which she always returned between assignments. A place that always smelled of the ocean and the specific food she had eaten as a child. She had spent more time outside of it than in it for the last 22 years. Returning always required a period of adjustment, getting used to the silence and warmth and how time moves differently when you are not at war. 6 weeks after her retirement, she received an invitation from the Memorial Commission, which was working on the reconstruction of the site on Yaren 4. The moon was no longer contested. The Commonwealth had officially abandoned its claims as part of the peace process, and the human colonial government designated the plain where 41 people died as a protected site. They were building something there. Nothing grandiose, the commission reported to her when they conducted a briefing. Something appropriate, stone, names, a place to stand and think. They asked if she would come to the dedication. She went. The plain was still rusty brown. Some things do not change. The sky was still the same brownish yellow, the light weak and slightly sickly. She stood on the ground she had looked at from the ridge and felt the ground under her boots hard and real. And she looked at what they had built. It was a long wall of dark stone, low, a height a person could reach without stretching. 41 names were carved into it. Deep cuts, clean and crisp. No rank, no unit, no designation. Just names, full names, first and last in the order they appeared in the field report, the document that listed them in a column under the heading Hours. She stood before it for a long time. She had memorized them many years ago. She spoke them now quietly in her head, not because she had forgotten who any of them were. She would never have forgotten any of them, just because they deserved to be named. Just because naming a name, even silently, even only to oneself, was a way of insisting that the name still meant something. She heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had long ago learned to let people approach at their own pace. Colonel Vance? She turned. A young Keth stood a few meters away, uncertain like a person approaching a stranger and uncertain of the reception. She was young, very young, perhaps 22 to 23 years old by Keth count. On her shoulder was the badge of the Memorial Commission. Vance said, "I am retired. Just Sarah." The young Keth stepped forward a little. "Excuse me for disturbing you. I work for the Commission as a junior cultural liaison. I worked with the architects on the translation of the names." She looked at the wall. It was important to us, to the Keth team, that they be correct. Vance also looked at the wall. The names were correct. She had checked them when she arrived. "Thank you," she said. "They are correct." They stood before the wall together for a moment. Then the Keth cautiously said, "Did you know this would end like this? When it started? When it was still happening? Did you know?" Vance thought about this. An honest question deserved an honest answer. "No," she said. "You were afraid it wouldn't happen every day." The Keth looked at the names. She paused for a moment, as young people do when they search for words for something they feel but haven't yet said. "My people have a saying," she said. "It is old. It comes from our war, the one 800 years ago that almost destroyed us. It roughly translates to, 'The line that cannot be crossed is the one that those who died protecting.'" Vance nodded. She looked at the names. The Keth said, "Humans have something similar." Vance paused for a moment. She thought about the document, the one that lay on the table at Meridian Point. The copy that Vreth had brought, which now resided in the legal archive and the treaty in the Galactic Registry, written 400 years ago, simple and clear. She thought about what it was, in its essence. Not articles, not a legal framework, but what lay beneath all of it. The reason it was written, and the reason it had held, and the reason 37 civilizations had placed their seal on it on Thursday morning in a room built specifically for this purpose. She thought about why humans had written it in the first place after a war that had claimed tens of millions of lives. After things that would be difficult to say directly even now, they had climbed out of it and sat down and written rules. Not because they were better than what they had done. Not because they were sure they would keep the rules, but because the rules had meaning anyway. Because you wrote them down so that in the next time after this failure, those who come after you have something to hold on to. You wrote them down so that the line existed, so that when someone crossed it, there was a word for what they had done. She said, "Yes, we have something similar." She did not say what exactly. She didn't need to. The Keth stood beside her on the rusty brown plain under the yellow sky, and the wind went across the field, as wind always goes across open ground, low and constant. And it carried nothing but itself. The line was in the stone, the names were in the line, and the line would be there long after everyone who stood before it today became names in their own records, in their own walls, in their own memorials. Long after they all departed, and the plain turned into whatever it would turn into, and new species found their way onto this border moon that had no real name and had never been beautiful, and which became, as happens with places where lines are drawn and held, something to which the galaxy would return. Not to celebrate, but to remember. To stand before the names and speak them quietly and know what they mean, and carry the line forward one more day, one more generation, one more civilization at a time into what comes next.